Chapter 7, the Judicial System. Our judicial system sets up several things for us. The first is that it provides us with equal justice under law. It protects everyone, although that tends to be the majority, but it does say that everyone should know and obey the laws, that ignorance is no excuse. There are 4 different kinds of laws. The first is a statutory, and statutory laws are those that are passed by lawmaking bodies. So things that are passed by Congress, things that are passed by your state government, things that are passed by your local government, like the city of Remsen passing laws, those would all be statutory laws. The second are common laws, and common laws are based on common sense or common practice, whichever one it is. Basically, it follows the same decisions as previous cases, so that's kind of how that operates. The third is administrative, and administrative laws are made by government agencies. So, for example, the Consumer Product Safety Commission would be an example of an administrative law, that they pass laws that companies have to follow to make sure that your products are safe for you to use. That's why they have recalls on things. The fourth are constitutional laws, and constitutional laws come from the Constitution. And constitutional laws are above all other laws, that every other law has to obey constitutional law. So, within all these laws, we have the courts, and the courts have a certain role. They actually have 3 roles that they do for us. The first is that they help to settle disputes, and disputes are basically fights or arguments, so they help to settle arguments. The second is that they interpret laws. So the courts are there to help us interpret the law in terms of what does it mean, who does it apply to, how does it apply, what could be the punishment for it. So it helps us to interpret those laws. The third is that they are there to give us a fair trial. And when I talk about us, I'm talking about people who are accused of crimes. And that could be anybody. So giving them a fair trial. So we're going to look into that right to a fair trial a little bit more in depth. The first of your rights to a fair trial is that you do have the right to a lawyer. You can choose your own, or it can be provided to you. But basically it boils down to the same thing, that you are probably not a lawyer, and you probably do not have any training in the law, and you don't know how the court system works exactly, and you don't know when you should object and when you should agree with things. And so having a lawyer is going to help you go through that process a lot easier, so that you don't make mistakes and end up in jail because you made a mistake in your trial. The second right to a fair trial is the right to be released on bail. Now, bail is the sum of money that is given to the court in order for you to be released from jail. But basically, it's saying that I'm going to give you this money, and in return, I'm going to show up for my trial. But I don't have to stay in jail until my trial starts. So that's basically what it is. It's a monetary promise that you're going to show up for your trial date. The third right to a fair trial is indictment by grand jury. And I know indictment doesn't look like at all how it is spelled, but that's how it's pronounced, indictment by grand jury. And basically what this is, an indictment is a formal accusation, basically saying we think you did this. And the grand jury is there to decide if there's enough evidence for a trial. Now, typically an indictment by a grand jury only happens in the case of really high crimes like murder or rape or kidnapping. Those typically would have an indictment by a grand jury. But smaller cases like divorce proceedings and those kinds of things, they tend to not need a grand jury. They go right to trial. The next one is a jury trial, and most civil cases are decided by a petit jury. And a petit jury is a group of jurors, and jurors are people who serve on the jury. But it's a group of jurors of 6 to 12 people who live in your community, who are your peers, the people that you live around. They have the same standards as you in terms of what their expectation is of the law, because you all live in the same community. It'd be different if you had, if you committed a crime here in Iowa and we brought in jurors from California, they'd have a whole different mindset than Iowans would have. And so they would find different things to look at and maybe come up with an entirely different verdict in the trial. So having a jury trial of your peers, people who live in your community, is more fair than importing in other ones. So the next one is you are innocent until proven guilty, which is kind of a nice thing in our government, that they need to prove, and when I say they, the prosecution needs to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed the crime. And they figure that out because lawyers are able to cross-examine or to question witnesses and question you if need be, but they have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that a reasonable person would not think that you did this crime or whatever. So they have to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. It's very, very unique. In a lot of other countries, you are considered guilty until you prove yourself innocent. That's much harder to do, actually. So we are very fortunate to have that as one of our kind of rights to our fair trial. And the next is the right of appeal. And when you appeal a case, you are asking for the judge or a group of judges to review your case and see if there was a mistake made. If that appeal is granted, you go on to a higher court, and typically you go to your state Supreme Court, and if you don't like that decision, you think that was wrong too, you can appeal to the U.S. Supreme Court, which we'll get into in the next video. The next right is your right to not testify. As a defendant, you have the right to not stand up and say, I did it. You have the ability to not testify. It's part of the Fifth Amendment. And so a lot of times if you hear people say, I plead the Fifth, it's because they're saying, I'm not going to say I was guilty. So you do have that protection. You never have to take the stand as a defendant. Typically, if you do, it's because you have something really good that's going to be in your defense. But typically, you don't have to. And finally, the last one is to hear and question all witnesses in the trial. And that means that you get to sit in and hear what they have to say, and you also get to question them to make sure that they're remembering things right. And so you do that for both the witnesses that are for you, and you do those for the witnesses that are against you. So you have the right to hear all sides of the story and to figure out who's lying and whatnot. So the jury gets the ability as well to hear both sides, so that way they are able to make up their mind to make their verdict. So like I said, in our next video we will get into the federal court system and the Supreme Court.